The power outage hit Mercy General Hospital at exactly 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October. David Martinez was halfway through his routine security rounds when the lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, leaving the corridors bathed in the eerie red glow of emergency lighting. Backup generators should kick in any second, David muttered to himself, consulting his checklist. After 5 years of working the graveyard shift, he'd become intimately familiar with every system, every protocol, every sound the building made during the quiet hours when most of the world slept. The generators hummed to life, but something was wrong. The lights in the east wing remained dark, and David's radio crackled with static instead of the usual clear communication from the central security desk. "Martinez to base," he spoke into his radio. "East wing still dark. Going to check the backup electrical room." Static. David frowned. The backup electrical room was in the basement, accessible through a service corridor that ran beneath the surgical wing. In 5 years, he'd only been down there twice, once during training and once during a gas leak evacuation. It wasn't part of his normal rounds. As he descended the service stairs, David's military training kicked in automatically. 8 years in the Army had taught him to notice details that others missed, to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. And tonight, everything felt wrong. The basement corridor was longer than he remembered, stretching into darkness that his flashlight barely penetrated. The walls were lined with pipes and electrical conduits, creating a maze of shadows that seemed to move with each step. That's when he heard it, the soft hum of machinery that shouldn't have been running during a power outage. David paused, listening carefully. The sound was coming from beyond the electrical room, from a section of the basement he'd never explored. Following protocol, he should have headed straight to the generators, but his instincts told him to investigate. The corridor ended at a heavy steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only, Biohazard." David had never seen this door before, despite 5 years of walking these halls. More concerning, it was slightly ajar, and soft light spilled through the crack. David approached carefully, his hand instinctively moving to the security baton on his belt. Through the gap, he could see what appeared to be a fully equipped surgical suite, stainless steel tables, monitors, and equipment that belonged in the hospital's main operating rooms, not hidden in the basement. But it was the voices that made his blood freeze. "Patient is prepped and ready for harvest," a man's voice said clinically. "Liver, kidneys, heart, and corneas. Total market value approximately 400,000. "Excellent," replied a woman with a cultured accent. "The buyers are standing by. How long until we can begin extraction?" David pressed closer to the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the crack, he could see 2 figures in surgical scrubs standing over an operating table. The patient appeared to be unconscious, connected to monitors that showed steady vital signs. "Dr. Morrison says we proceed in 6 hours, the man continued. "That gives us time to complete the documentation and prepare the transport containers." 6 hours. David glanced at his watch. 11:47 p.m. Whatever they were planning would happen at 5:47 a.m. "What about the family?" the woman asked. "They think their father is recovering from routine gallbladder surgery. By the time they realize something's wrong, we'll have completed the harvest and disposed of the evidence. Another tragic surgical complication." David's military training had exposed him to violence, death, and human cruelty in countless forms. But this was different. This was medical professionals, people trusted to heal, systematically murdering patients for profit. The patient on the table moved slightly, turning his head toward the door. Even in the dim light, David could see that the man was conscious, his eyes wide with terror above the breathing mask. He was awake, aware, and completely helpless. This wasn't surgery. It was live organ harvesting. David backed away from the door, his mind racing. He needed to call the police, the FBI, someone who could stop this nightmare. But as he turned to leave, his foot caught a loose pipe, sending a metallic clang echoing through the corridor. The voices in the surgical suite stopped immediately. "What was that?" the woman hissed. "Probably just the building settling. These old hospitals make noise. Check it anyway. We can't afford any complications." David heard footsteps approaching the door and realized he had seconds to disappear. The corridor offered no hiding places, no alternate exits. If they caught him here, he'd become another surgical complication. He ran. David sprinted through the basement corridors, his flashlight beam dancing wildly as he navigated the maze of pipes and electrical equipment. Behind him, he heard the steel door slam open and angry voices echoing through the darkness. Someone was here. Find them. Now! David reached the service stairs and took them 3 at a time, bursting through the basement door into the main hospital corridor. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, and his own breathing sounded impossibly loud in the silence. He needed to get to the security office, call the police, document everything he'd seen. But as he rounded the corner toward the main desk, David stopped dead. Dr. Sarah Morrison, Mercy General's chief of surgery, was standing at the security desk talking quietly with Officer Bradley Chen, the police liaison who worked with hospital security. They were reviewing paperwork and speaking in hushed tones, but David caught enough words to understand they were discussing the procedure scheduled for dawn. Dr. Morrison, the woman whose voice he'd heard in the basement. Officer Chen, law enforcement complicit in medical murder. The conspiracy didn't just involve rogue doctors. It included hospital administration and local police. And David Martinez, minimum wage security guard with no connections and no power, had stumbled into the middle of it. As if sensing his presence, Dr. Morrison looked up and made eye contact with David across the lobby. For a moment, neither moved. Then her expression shifted from mild curiosity to sharp recognition. She knew that he knew. David turned and walked calmly toward the elevator, forcing himself not to run. Behind him, he heard Dr. Morrison's voice rise slightly as she spoke to Officer Chen, though he couldn't make out the words. In the elevator, David's hands shook as he pressed the button for the 3rd floor. He had 6 hours to stop a murder conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful and trusted people in the city. And if he failed, an innocent man would die, his organs sold to the highest bidder. But first, David had to survive the night. Because Dr. Morrison's expression had told him everything he needed to know. They would kill him to protect their secret. The elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor, and David stepped into another nightmare. This one was just beginning. The 3rd floor of Mercy General was supposed to be David's sanctuary, a maze of storage rooms, supply closets, and administrative offices that few people accessed during the night shift. But as he made his way through the darkened corridors, David realized that nowhere in the hospital was safe anymore. His radio crackled to life with Dr. Morrison's voice, calm and professional. "Security to all stations. We have a potential intruder in the building. All personnel should report any unusual activity immediately." David turned off his radio. They were hunting him now. He needed evidence, proof of what he'd witnessed that would be credible enough to convince outside authorities. His word alone, A night security guard with no medical training wouldn't be enough to bring down respected doctors and police officers. The administrative wing held the key. If this organ harvesting operation was as systematic as it appeared, there would be records, financial transactions, and documentation that could expose the entire conspiracy. David used his security key card to access Dr. Morrison's office. The space was exactly what he'd expected. Diplomas covering the walls, medical journals stacked on expensive furniture, and photographs showing Morrison with local politicians and medical celebrities. Her computer was password protected, but David had learned a few things about electronic security during his Army service. More importantly, he'd observed Dr. Morrison entering her password during security briefings. Hippocratic 123. A twisted irony for someone violating every principle of medical ethics. The computer unlocked, revealing files that made David's stomach turn. Project Renewal was the innocuous name for the organ harvesting operation. Spreadsheets detailed the inventory of patients selected for harvest, complete with blood types, organ compatibility, and market values. Financial records showed millions of dollars in transactions, with offshore accounts and international buyers. But the most damning evidence was the patient selection criteria. The victims weren't random. They were specifically chosen based on social vulnerability. Homeless individuals, elderly patients with no family, undocumented immigrants, and people with mental health issues who wouldn't be missed or whose deaths could be easily explained. David found the file for tonight's victim. Robert Fletcher, 67, homeless veteran admitted for gallbladder surgery. No next of kin, no insurance, no one who would ask uncomfortable questions when he died on the operating table. The schedule showed that Robert Fletcher was the third victim this month. The previous two had been listed as surgical complications in the hospital's official records. But the Project Renewal files showed they'd been murdered for their organs, which were sold to buyers in 3 different countries. David photographed everything with his phone, though he knew the images alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to document the basement surgical suite, record the conversations, and somehow get evidence to authorities who weren't part of the conspiracy. That's when he heard footsteps in the corridor outside Morrison's office. David quickly logged out of the computer and moved to the window. The 3rd floor was too high to jump, but the window opened onto a maintenance ledge that ran along the building's exterior. It was narrow, dangerous, and probably his only way out. The footsteps stopped outside the office door. David heard the soft beep of a keycard being scanned. He slipped through the window onto the ledge just as the office door opened. Through the glass, he watched Dr. Morrison enter with 2 security guards he didn't recognize, men who definitely weren't part of the hospital's regular staff. "Search everything," Morrison ordered. "He was here. Check the computer logs." David pressed himself against the building's exterior wall, 30 feet above the parking lot. The October wind cut through his security uniform, and the narrow ledge made every movement precarious. But military training had taught him patience and the ability to remain motionless for hours when necessary. Through the window, he watched Morrison discover that her computer had been accessed. Her expression shifted from concern to rage as she realized the scope of what David might have learned. "He knows," she said into her phone. "Everything. We need to accelerate the timeline." David couldn't hear the response, but Morrison's next words chilled him. "No, we can't wait until dawn. Move up the harvest to 3 a.m. and find Martinez. He's become a liability that needs to be eliminated." 3 in the morning. David checked his watch. 12:31 a.m. He now had less than 3 hours to stop a murder and save his own life. Morrison left the office with her security team, and David carefully climbed back through the window. The building's layout gave him one advantage. He knew every corridor, every stairwell, and every hiding place better than Morrison's hired killers. But knowing the building wouldn't be enough. He needed allies, and he needed them fast. David made his way to the employee lounge on the second floor, where he knew the night nursing staff took their breaks. If anyone in the hospital could be trusted, it would be the nurses who actually cared for patients, rather than administrators who saw them as profit centers. He found Maria Santos, a veteran ICU nurse, reviewing patient charts over a cup of coffee. Maria had been at Mercy General for 15 years, and David had developed a professional relationship with her during his security rounds. "David?" Maria looked up in surprise. "What are you doing here? I heard they were looking for you." "Maria, I need your help," David said quietly, checking to make sure they were alone. "I've discovered something terrible and I don't have much time." He showed her the photographs from Morrison's computer, watching her expression change from confusion to horror as she understood what she was seeing. "This is impossible," Maria whispered. "Dr. Morrison is one of the most respected surgeons in the state. These records, they have to be fake." "I saw the basement surgical suite with my own eyes," David insisted. "There's a patient down there right now, scheduled to be murdered for his organs at 3 a.m. Maria stared at the images on David's phone, her medical training helping her understand the implications faster than most people could have. "Robert Fletcher," she said suddenly. "I admitted him yesterday for gallbladder surgery, simple procedure, low risk. But when I checked on him this evening, he'd been moved to a private room and his chart was flagged as restricted access. That's him. Maria, they're going to kill him in 2.5 hours unless we stop them." Maria's expression hardened. "What do you need me to do?" David had found his ally. Now he needed a plan that could save Robert Fletcher's life and expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the hospital's administration. But first, they had to survive the hunt that was closing in around them. Maria Santos led David through service corridors that even he hadn't known existed after 5 years in the building. As the senior ICU nurse, she'd learned the hospital's hidden pathways during medical emergencies when seconds could mean the difference between life and death. "The patient records are kept in the central server room," Maria explained as they moved through a maintenance tunnel. "If Morrison's operation is as big as those files suggest, there will be digital records of every victim." They emerged in the hospital's Information Technology Center, a climate-controlled room filled with servers that managed everything from patient records to security systems. Maria's access badge granted them entry, but David knew their presence here would be logged and eventually traced. "How much time do we have?" Maria asked, logging into the central patient database. David checked his watch. 1 hour and 45 minutes until they murder Robert Fletcher. Maria's fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing patient records that painted an even more horrifying picture than David had imagined. The organ harvesting operation had been running for over 2 years, with at least 30 victims whose deaths had been classified as surgical complications or natural causes. "Look at this," Maria said, pointing to a pattern in the data. Every victim was admitted for routine procedures: gallbladder surgery, appendectomies, hernia repairs, simple operations with low mortality rates. But somehow, these specific patients all died during surgery. The death certificates were signed by different doctors, but David noticed that Dr. Morrison had been the attending physician for every single case. She'd personally overseen the murder of 30 innocent people. "There's more," Maria continued, accessing financial records that should have been restricted. The hospital has been receiving anonymous donations totaling millions of dollars. The timing corresponds exactly with the harvesting schedule. David studied the payment patterns and felt sick. They're being paid per organ. Heart, liver, kidneys. Each one has a different market value based on blood type and compatibility. But the most damning discovery came when Maria accessed the hospital's security footage archives. The system automatically stored surveillance video for 6 months before deletion, and David's security credentials allowed him to review the recordings. They watched in horror as previous victims were wheeled into the basement surgical suite, while appearing to be conscious but paralyzed. They saw medical staff transporting coolers labeled as medical supplies that were clearly designed for organ transport. They documented a systematic murder operation that had been happening under everyone's noses for years. "We need to contact the FBI," Maria said. "This is organized crime on a massive scale." "Morrison mentioned law enforcement involvement," David replied. "We don't know how deep this goes. Local police, maybe state authorities. We can't trust anyone in the system." That's when they heard voices in the corridor outside the server room. "Check every access point. Martinez knows the building better than we do, but he can't hide forever." David recognized the voice. Dr. James Harrison, Morrison's deputy, and the man he'd heard in the basement surgical suite. They were conducting a methodical search of the entire hospital. "Download everything," David whispered to Maria. "Patient records, financial data, security footage. We need it all on a device we can take with us." Maria connected a high-capacity flash drive to the server and began transferring files. The process would take several minutes they didn't have. Through the server room's glass walls, David watched the search team methodically checking each office and storage room. They were wearing surgical scrubs instead of security uniforms, and their movements suggested military or law enforcement training. These weren't hospital employees. They were professional killers brought in to clean up the mess David had created. "How much longer?" David asked. 3 minutes for the download to complete. The search team was 2 rooms away and moving closer. David realized they needed a distraction, something that would draw the killers away from the server room long enough for the download to finish. "When the download is done, take the drive and get out of the hospital," David told Maria. "Drive straight to the FBI field office in Charlotte. Don't trust local law enforcement." "What about you?" "I'm going to make sure they follow me instead of you." David slipped out of the server room through a maintenance access panel, leaving Maria to complete the download. He made his way to the hospital's central stairwell, where his footsteps would echo loud enough to draw attention. The distraction worked. Within minutes, he heard the search team pursuing him through the stairwell, while Maria escaped with the evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. But David's relief was short-lived. As he reached the first floor, he found himself face-to-face with Dr. Morrison and a man he didn't recognize. Tall, well-dressed, and carrying the kind of authority that suggested federal law enforcement. "Mr. Martinez," Morrison said calmly, "I think it's time we had a conversation." The man beside her flashed credentials that made David's blood freeze. Detective Lieutenant Marcus Webb, North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. The conspiracy didn't just involve local police. It reached state law enforcement, which meant Maria might be driving straight into a trap. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble tonight," Detective Webb said, "but we're prepared to offer you a deal." David realized he was looking at the true scope of the operation. This wasn't just organ harvesting. It was organized crime with law enforcement protection, medical legitimacy, and political connections that could make evidence disappear and witnesses vanish. Robert Fletcher would die in 73 minutes unless David could find a way to expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond a single hospital. But first, he had to survive the next few minutes without becoming another surgical complication. "The deal is simple," Detective Webb explained as they stood in the hospital's main lobby. "You forget everything you think you saw tonight, and we arrange a transfer to a security position at another facility. Better pay, better benefits, clean slate." David studied Webb's face, noting the micro-expressions that betrayed confidence in his position. This wasn't negotiation, it was a final warning before elimination. "And if I refuse?" David asked. Dr. Morrison smiled coldly. "Then you'll suffer an unfortunate accident. Security guards have dangerous jobs, falls down stairwells, encounters with unstable patients, equipment malfunctions. Hospitals can be very hazardous places." David's military training had taught him to assess tactical situations quickly. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and facing enemies with institutional authority to cover up his death. But he also knew that Webb and Morrison needed to maintain appearances. A violent confrontation in the hospital lobby would create evidence and witnesses they couldn't control. "I need time to think," David said. "You have 10 minutes, Webb replied, checking his watch. "Then we proceed with or without your cooperation." David walked toward the hospital's main entrance, knowing they would follow at a distance. Outside, the October night was cold and clear, with a full moon that cast sharp shadows across the parking lot. He had 45 minutes until Robert Fletcher's murder, and he was running out of options. Maria had escaped with evidence, but reaching the FBI would take hours, and David wasn't certain the federal authorities weren't also compromised. Then he remembered something from his military training. When conventional tactics fail, use unconventional ones. David pulled out his phone and opened the live streaming app he'd installed months ago to record security incidents. With a few taps, he was broadcasting live video to the internet, his location automatically tagged and his stream visible to anyone worldwide. "My name is David Martinez," he said clearly into the camera. "I'm a security guard at Mercy General Hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina. I've discovered a massive organ harvesting conspiracy involving hospital administrators, surgeons, and state law enforcement." The stream viewer count began climbing, 50, 100, 200 people watching in real time. At 3 a.m. tonight, in exactly 42 minutes, they're going to murder a homeless veteran named Robert Fletcher and sell his organs on the black market. This is the evidence I've gathered. David held up his phone, showing the photographs he'd taken from Morrison's computer. He read aloud from the patient files, financial records, and victim lists, while hundreds of viewers watched and shared the stream. Behind him, he heard rapid footsteps as Webb and Morrison realized what he was doing. But David kept talking, providing names, dates, and specific details that could be verified independently. Dr. Sarah Morrison, Chief of Surgery, is running this operation with Detective Lieutenant Marcus Webb from the State Bureau of Investigation. They've murdered at least 30 people over the past 2 years, targeting homeless individuals and patients with no family. The viewer count hit 1,000, then 2,000. Comments flooded in from people recording the stream, copying the information, and sharing it across social media platforms. "David!" Morrison's voice carried barely controlled fury. "Stop this immediately!" David turned the camera toward Morrison and Webb as they approached. "These are the people responsible. Dr. Sarah Morrison and Detective Marcus Webb. They're about to threaten me to stop exposing their murder conspiracy." Webb's hand moved toward his weapon, but David had positioned himself in full view of the hospital's exterior security cameras. Any violence would be recorded and transmitted live to thousands of witnesses. The patient scheduled to die is in room B47 in the basement surgical suite, David continued. Robert Fletcher, homeless veteran, admitted for gallbladder surgery. He's being held in an illegal operating room while his organs are prepared for harvest. The stream viewer count hit 5,000 and was climbing exponentially. David could see panic in Morrison's eyes as she realized the international scope of the exposure. "You have no idea what you've done," Webb hissed. "This operation has protection at the highest levels. You're destroying years of careful work." "Good," David replied, still broadcasting. "Detective Webb just admitted on livestream that this organ harvesting conspiracy has protection at the highest levels of government." Webb lunged forward, trying to grab David's phone, but David was ready. Military training had taught him hand-to-hand combat, and he used Webb's momentum against him, sending the detective sprawling across the parking lot asphalt. Morrison was shouting into her radio, probably ordering the acceleration of Fletcher's murder. But David had created an international incident. Thousands of people now knew about the conspiracy, had recorded evidence, and were demanding immediate investigation. "I'm going to try to save Robert Fletcher," David announced to his audience. "If something happens to me, you know who's responsible. Don't let them cover this up." He ended the live stream and pocketed his phone. The evidence was now in the hands of thousands of witnesses worldwide, beyond the reach of any conspiracy to suppress. But Robert Fletcher was still scheduled to die in 37 minutes, and David was the only person in position to stop it. He ran back into the hospital, leaving Webb and Morrison to deal with the media firestorm he'd just created. Behind him, he could hear sirens approaching, whether they belonged to legitimate law enforcement or conspiracy cleanup crews. He couldn't tell. David had one final mission: reach the basement surgical suite and save an innocent man's life before the killers decided their timeline had changed. The countdown to murder was approaching 0, and David Martinez was running out of time. David's live stream had created chaos throughout the hospital. Emergency personnel were arriving, senior administrators were being awakened at home, and the basement surgical suite was suddenly flooded with activity as Morrison's team tried to accelerate their timeline. David used the confusion to access the service corridors he knew better than anyone in the building. His military training kicked in as he moved through the hospital like a guerrilla fighter in hostile territory, avoiding the search teams while closing in on his objective. The basement was heavily guarded now. David counted at least 6 men in surgical scrubs stationed at various access points, all carrying weapons that definitely weren't standard hospital equipment. Morrison had called in serious backup, but David had one advantage they couldn't overcome. He'd spent 5 years learning every pipe, every electrical conduit, and every maintenance access point in this building. He crawled through an air duct that ran parallel to the surgical suite, following the sound of voices and machinery to locate Robert Fletcher. Through a ventilation grate, he could see the illegal operating room clearly. Fletcher was conscious but paralyzed, his eyes wide with terror as masked figures prepared surgical instruments around him. Monitors showed his vital signs, elevated heart rate and blood pressure indicating he was aware of everything happening to him. "Patient is prepped for emergency harvest," a voice announced. "We proceed immediately." David checked his watch. 2:51 a.m. They were starting 9 minutes early, probably hoping to complete the murder before any outside authorities could respond to his live stream. David needed to act fast, but a direct assault would get both him and Fletcher killed. Instead, he used his knowledge of the hospital's infrastructure to create a different kind of chaos. From his position in the air duct, David could access the building's emergency systems. He triggered the fire suppression system specifically for the basement level, flooding the surgical suite with foam and chemical suppressants that made surgery impossible. Alarms blared throughout the building as the automatic system assumed there was a chemical fire in the basement. The surgical team was forced to evacuate, leaving Fletcher alone but alive on the operating table. David dropped through the ventilation grate and landed in the foam-filled surgical suite. Fletcher's eyes focused on him with desperate hope. "You're going to be okay," David said, checking Fletcher's restraints. "I'm getting you out of here." But removing the paralytic drugs from Fletcher's system would take time they didn't have. David could hear Morrison's voice echoing through the corridors, coordinating a response to his sabotage. "Shut down the fire suppression system. Get back in there and complete the harvest." David realized he needed to move Fletcher to a location where witnesses could protect him. The main emergency room would be filling with personnel responding to the fire alarm, creating safety through visibility. He disconnected Fletcher's IV lines and monitoring equipment, then lifted the paralyzed veteran onto a surgical gurney. Fletcher couldn't move or speak, but his eyes communicated understanding and gratitude. David pushed the gurney through the foam-filled corridor, racing toward the service elevator that would take them to the main hospital floors. Behind him, he heard Morrison's security team entering the basement, their angry voices growing closer. The elevator seemed to take forever to arrive. When the doors finally opened, David found himself face to face with Detective Webb, who was holding a pistol pointed directly at his chest. "End of the line, Martinez," Webb said. "Step away from the patient." David positioned himself between Webb and Fletcher's gurney. "Thousands of people are watching this story. If you shoot me, it becomes international news." "Accidents happen during hospital emergencies," Webb replied. "Confused veteran attacks security guard. Tragic misunderstanding." That's when Maria Santos stepped out of the elevator behind Webb. "Actually, Detective, this is being recorded live by Channel 7 News," Maria said calmly. "They're upstairs broadcasting everything in real time." Webb spun around, and David used the distraction to disarm him. Military combat training proved more effective than police academy tactics, and Webb found himself on the floor with his own weapon pointed at his head. "Maria, how did you—" "The FBI field office was compromised, just like you suspected," Maria explained as they loaded Fletcher into the elevator. "But I contacted a journalist friend who works for the Charlotte Observer. She brought in federal marshals from outside the state." As the elevator rose toward the main hospital floors, David could hear the sound of multiple agencies flooding the building. The conspiracy that had operated in darkness for 2 years was being exposed under the harsh lights of media attention and federal investigation. The elevator doors opened to reveal a scene that would have been impossible an hour earlier. FBI agents, federal marshals, and news crews flooding the hospital lobby while Morrison and her team were led away in handcuffs. Robert Fletcher would live. The organ harvesting conspiracy was exposed, and David Martinez, invisible security guard turned unlikely hero, had prevented a murder through courage, intelligence, and the power of truth. The sun was rising over Charlotte as federal agents completed their sweep of Mercy General Hospital. David sat in the emergency room, giving his statement to FBI agent Sarah Chen, while medics monitored Robert Fletcher's recovery from the paralytic drugs. 37 victims confirmed, Agent Chen reported. The financial records show organ sales totaling over $15 million. This was one of the largest black market operations we've ever uncovered. Through the emergency room windows, David watched news vans lining the street as reporters broadcast the story to a world that had been following his live stream. Mercy General conspiracy was trending globally, with millions of people demanding justice for the victims. Dr. Morrison has been charged with 37 counts of first-degree murder, Agent Chen continued. Detective Webb faces federal conspiracy charges, and we're investigating his connections within state law enforcement. Robert Fletcher was conscious now, his voice weak but clear. "You saved my life," he said to David. "I don't understand why, but thank you." David thought about the question. Why had he risked everything for a homeless veteran he'd never met? The answer went back to his military training, to the oath he'd taken to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "Because it was the right thing to do," David said simply. Agent Chen's phone rang with an update that made her smile. "The international buyers have been arrested in 4 different countries. Interpol coordinated simultaneous raids based on the evidence you provided. The investigation would continue for months, unraveling a conspiracy that reached international organized crime networks. But the immediate threat was over, and the victims would finally receive justice." Maria Santos joined them in the emergency room, looking exhausted but satisfied. "The hospital board has asked me to serve as interim chief of surgery while they rebuild the entire administration." "What about you, David?" Agent Chen asked. "The FBI could use someone with your investigative instincts and moral courage." David considered the offer. A federal career would mean better pay, more authority, and the chance to investigate crimes on a national scale. But it would also mean leaving behind the quiet life he'd built, the community he'd served, and the simple satisfaction of protecting people in small but meaningful ways. "I think I'll stick with security work," he said finally, "but maybe at a different hospital." 6 months later, David Martinez walked the night shift corridors of Presbyterian Hospital, 30 miles from the scene of his greatest triumph. The new job paid better, offered advancement opportunities, and came with the unspoken respect that followed his role in exposing the Mercy General conspiracy. But David remained fundamentally unchanged. He was still the quiet, observant security guard who noticed details others missed and treated every person with dignity regardless of their circumstances. The difference was that now people noticed him back. "Evening, Mr. Martinez," called Dr. Jennifer Walsh as she completed her rounds. "Everything quiet tonight?" "Just the way I like it," David replied with a smile. The media attention had faded, replaced by newer scandals and different outrages. But the impact of that October night continued to ripple through the medical community. Hospitals nationwide had implemented new oversight procedures. Federal regulations had been strengthened, and vulnerable populations received better protection. Robert Fletcher had become an advocate for homeless veterans, using his survival story to raise awareness about the exploitation of society's most vulnerable members. The financial settlement from Mercy General had given him housing, health care, and a purpose that extended far beyond his own experience. Maria Santos had transformed Mercy General into a model hospital for ethical practices and patient advocacy. She'd kept David's security badge in her office as a reminder that heroes often came from the most unexpected places. At 3 a.m., David's rounds took him past the ICU, where families maintained vigils beside loved ones fighting for their lives. He paused at each room, offering quiet words of encouragement to anyone who needed to talk. This was why he'd stayed in security work. Not for the recognition or advancement opportunities, but for moments like these. Small interactions that reminded him why some fights were worth having. His radio crackled with a routine message from the central desk, and David responded with the professional calm that had served him through military service. 5 years at Mercy General, and one night when he'd saved a life by refusing to stay invisible. All quiet on the 3rd floor, he reported. And for David Martinez, that was exactly how he liked it. Outside Presbyterian Hospital, the city of Charlotte slept peacefully, protected by countless invisible guardians who watched over them during the vulnerable hours of darkness. Most would never be recognized, never be celebrated, never see their stories told on international news. But they would continue their quiet service, knowing that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for glory or recognition, but simply because someone needs to stand up and do what's right. The invisible heroes who keep us safe while we sleep. This has been another Untold Legends story. Remember, the most important heroes are often the ones no one notices. That security guard walking the halls, that nurse checking on patients, that janitor cleaning the floors. They might just be the person standing between you and danger. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't about what you're willing to fight for. It's about what you're willing to risk when no one is watching.